13 black men who married older women will surprise you. What if some of the most powerful black men in Hollywood and music gave their hearts to women the world never expected them to choose? Not younger, not trendier, but older, sharper, and already carrying a strength of their own. These marriages broke the usual script of fame, masculinity, and romance, and some of the names on this list may leave you stunned. Stay with us and subscribe now to Black Legends Revealed for more stories that challenge everything people think they know. Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba. Before Hugh Masekela became the sleek trumpet voice of South African exile, Miriam Makeba was already a force large enough to shake continents. She was older, more famous, more politically dangerous to the regime back home, and already carrying the title the world would later fix on her forever Mama Africa. When they married in 1964, this was not some quiet romance tucked behind curtains. It was two black artists joining hands while their country was still under apartheid, their names already tangled with protest surveillance and the pain of being pushed far from home. He was still rising. She had already become an international symbol. That alone made the union electric. They did not come together in a soft season. They met in exile in the middle of movement speeches, records, passports, audiences, and the long ache of not belonging anywhere except on stage. Miriam had already spoken to the world in a voice that carried both beauty and accusation. Hugh had the restlessness of a man still becoming himself. What grew between them was charged from the beginning because love was never the only thing in the room. Fame was there. Politics was there. Africa was there. So was ambition. They were not just husband and wife walking into parties. They were a black couple standing in front of the world with history pressing on both shoulders. How many marriages could survive when the whole world is asking you to be a symbol before it lets you be a person? They performed, traveled, spoke, and carried the burden of representation wherever they went. Their names meant something beyond music, and that can turn even tenderness into work. Miriam had already lived enough life to know the price of being turned into an emblem. Hugh was still moving with the hunger of a younger artist who wanted space discovery and room to roam. The marriage lasted less than a decade, ending in 1966. But it burned itself into the story of black music anyway, because it joined two exiled spirits at a moment when neither of them was living an ordinary life. They parted, but the bond never shrank into something trivial. He stayed Hugh Masekela. She stayed Miriam Makeba. The marriage ended. The magnitude did not. Jamal Bryant and Gizelle Bryant. Jamal Bryant married Gizelle in 2002 at a time when he was becoming one of the most visible young pastors in the country, and she was stepping into married life with a man whose voice could fill a sanctuary and whose name already carried ambition. She was 2 years older, and that mattered in a quiet way because Gizelle never came across like a woman impressed by stage presence alone. She was polished, direct, socially strong, and fully capable of standing beside a man who lived under the pressure of the pulpit. They built a family, welcomed 3 daughters, and for a while the marriage looked like the kind churches like to present as evidence that charisma, calling, and home can all live under one roof. But church fame is its own kind of exposure. Jamal was not just a husband going to work every morning. He was a public figure constantly surrounded by attention, admiration, and the sort of access that can rot a marriage from the inside if discipline slips. Reports of infidelity kept circling around him, and those reports grew too heavy to ignore. By 2009, the marriage was over. Gizelle left with 3 daughters and a last name the public still tied to him, but she did not disappear into his story. She carried the girls forward, built her own public identity, and let people see what it looks like when the wife survives the collapse instead of being buried under it. How many women can watch a man preach loyalty in public while trying to survive the humiliation he brings home in private? Years passed, and their names found each other again in front of cameras when talk of reconciliation surfaced. By then, the old history had not cooled. It was still there in every conversation, every side-eye, every question about trust distance and whether a man who once broke the house could really be invited back into it. Jamal was in Atlanta at New Birth. Gizelle was in Maryland with their daughters and her own life moving in another direction. The second chapter never settled into peace for long because the first one had already left too much behind. Age never looked like the issue in their relationship. She was older, yes, but steadier too, and every time the marriage was tested, that became harder and harder not to notice. Steve Harvey and Marcia Harvey. Steve Harvey married Marcia Harvey in 1981, years before television turned him into a household name, and long before Family Feud best-selling books or arena-sized recognition made him look untouchable. He was born in 1957. Public biographical sources list Marcia as born in 1955, which placed her a little older than him from the start. Their marriage belonged to the chapter before the Empire, when his life was not yet a finished success story but a bet still being placed. Together they had 3 children. Twin daughters Brandy and Carly, followed later by their son Broderick Jr., and those children arrived while Steve was still trying to force his way into entertainment. He began working stand-up in the early 1980s, and the road to national fame did not move overnight. The public version of Steve Harvey that people know now came later. It's Showtime at the Apollo in 1993, Me and the Boys in 1994, The Steve Harvey Show in 1996, then the Kings of Comedy wave that pushed him into another level of visibility. All of that came after years when comedy was still unstable work and the future had not paid him back yet. Marcia was living inside that version of the story, not the polished one that would come later. How many women stay long enough to see the dream before the world sees the man, then watch the dream grow so large it starts pulling him away from the house that first held him up? Their marriage ended in 1994. Public summaries of his life consistently mark that as the year his first marriage closed, just as the career was entering the stretch that would make him far more visible. After that came the bigger titles, the larger audiences, the books, radio talk shows, and the global version of Steve Harvey people now recognize instantly. Marcia did not arrive in that public victory lap. Her place is earlier in the story, when the future still looked uncertain. The family was already real, and the man had not yet become the brand. Ving Rhames and Deborah Reed. Ving Rhames never carried the kind of screen presence that made people expect a quiet marriage. On film, he looked built for danger pressure and confrontation, the man whose voice alone could turn a scene heavy. That image followed him through Pulp Fiction, Con Air, Baby Boy, and then deep into the Mission Impossible years. But in his private life, the rhythm was different. In 2000, he married Deborah Reed, a woman older than him by nearly a decade. And while Hollywood kept running on noise reinvention and public spectacle, that relationship stayed almost entirely outside the machine. It did not arrive as a red carpet fairy tale people were meant to obsess over. It sat there in the background while his career kept moving steady and largely untouched by the usual circus around celebrity romance. That kind of choice says something. A man with Ving Rhames' image could have lived loudly if he wanted to. He could have leaned into the mythology of fame, let the tabloids feed on him, turned his marriage into another extension of celebrity. He did not. Deborah Reed was not presented to the public like a trophy, not pushed into the gossip cycle, not used to decorate his stardom. She stayed where real partnership usually stays when it does not need applause. How many men in Hollywood build a career that big and still keep the most important part of their personal life almost completely out of public reach? Years passed. Franchises grew, generations of stars came and went, and Ving Rhames remained there, still carrying one of the most recognizable voices and faces in American film. Through all of that, the marriage stayed intact. That is the part people do not expect when they first hear his name. Not because the woman beside him was older, but because the life he chose with her was so much quieter than the one his screen image always promised. In an industry that rarely rewards privacy, he kept that door closed and let the work speak louder. Blair Underwood and Desiree DaCosta. Blair Underwood married Desiree DaCosta in 1994, just as his face was already becoming familiar to television audiences from LA Law, and what followed was not a short Hollywood detour, but a marriage that lasted 27 years and brought 3 children into the center of their life together. He kept building an acting career across film, television, stage work, and later projects that stretched from Deep Impact to Dirty Sexy Money to Long Legs, while Desiree worked largely away from the glare tied to the business side of entertainment rather than the constant public performance of celebrity marriage. Their split was announced in May 2021, and the statement they released made clear they were closing a long chapter, not a brief experiment. What gives this relationship real weight inside your title is not just that the woman was older. It is that Blair's rise happened inside a marriage that never needed to turn itself into spectacle to feel important. Desiree was there through the long stretch when his career had to be managed like a real life, not a fantasy. There were children to raise, a household to hold together, and years in which his visibility kept expanding while hers stayed deliberately quieter. That kind of arrangement asks for steadiness more than glamour, and it leaves a different trace than the usual celebrity pairing people remember only through red carpets and tabloid photographs. How many women can stand beside a famous man for nearly 3 decades and still have the world act as if they were only background to his story? When they separated, they did not drag the ending through public mud. They spoke about gratitude, beautiful children, and the different paths ahead of them after 27 years together. Then life kept moving. In 2023, Blair married longtime friend Josie Hart, which placed an official endpoint on the Desiree chapter in the public record, but it did not erase what came before it. Those 27 years remain one of the longest marriages in his life story, and one of the clearest reminders that before later reinventions and later romances, there was a woman older than him who shared the long middle stretch while the career was still being built and sustained. Kenny Lattimore and Chanté Moore. Kenny Lattimore did not build his name on noise. He came into R&B with a voice that moved like velvet, first breaking through with his 1996 debut and the title track For You, then settling into the lane of grown man ballads that made him a favorite for listeners who wanted romance without theatrics. When he married Chanté Moore in Jamaica on New Year's Day in 2002, the pairing felt bigger than a celebrity wedding headline. She was already a proven R&B name with hits poise and a full career behind her, and she was 3 years older than him. That age gap was not huge, but it mattered because it gave the relationship a different energy from the usual industry script. Kenny was not standing beside someone being introduced to fame. He was standing beside a woman who had already lived inside it. They did not keep the marriage hidden in private and then expect fans to piece it together later. They turned it into music. On February 11th, 2003, just weeks before their son was born, they released Things That Lovers Do, a duet album built from classic soul songs, and the title alone told people how they wanted the union to be seen. Their son Kenny Jr. arrived on April 10th, 2003, and the marriage kept moving through the mid-2000s with another joint project, Uncovered/Covered, released in 2006. For a while, they looked like the kind of R&B marriage fans wanted to believe in 2 seasoned voices, one home, one child, one stage, one polished image of mature black love. How many couples can sing love together in public and still carry the pressure of living up to that harmony once the microphones are off? Then, the chapter closed. In July 2011, news broke that Kenny and Chanté had divorced, ending nearly a decade of marriage. The music they made together stayed behind as proof of what the pairing had looked and sounded like when it worked. Today, both are still moving forward in public life. Kenny later married Judge Faith Jenkins in 2020 and welcomed a daughter in 2023, while Chanté married Stephen G. Hill in 2022 and continued her own career in music and television. But that earlier marriage still holds a place in this title because Kenny Lattimore's most visible love story was built with a woman older than him, already established, already fully herself, and never standing in his shadow. Nate Parker and Sarah DiSanto. Nate Parker met Sarah DiSanto at Penn State before film festivals, before magazine covers, before his name became attached to projects large enough to split public opinion. They were still college students then, long before The Great Debaters, Red Tails, Beyond the Lights, and long before The Birth of a Nation turned him into one of the most discussed names in black cinema for reasons both creative and personal. They married in August 2007 in Frontier Park in Erie, Pennsylvania, and the marriage that followed never became the kind of celebrity relationship people could consume every week. It stayed guarded, mostly out of reach, with Sarah keeping a low profile while Nate's career kept pushing him into brighter and harsher light. The family kept growing while the public version of Nate Parker kept shifting. Public biographical sources say the couple had 3 daughters together, and Parker also had 2 daughters from previous relationships, which meant the home he was building with Sarah was never small or simple. In 2016, as The Birth of a Nation exploded at Sundance and then became surrounded by fierce controversy, Sarah was still there. People reported at the time that they had already been together for years and were raising their children while he moved through that storm in full public view. How many marriages stay standing when the man inside them becomes a public argument instead of just a husband? The story has not stopped. In 2026, Parker is back in theaters with Newborn, the film he wrote and directed, released through AMC and Mansa Studios on April 10th. That matters because it shows how long Sarah's place in his life has lasted, from college to marriage to fatherhood to acclaim to backlash and into another release cycle nearly 2 decades later. The marriage was never sold as spectacle. It simply stayed there while the rest of his life kept changing shape. Teddy Pendergrass and Karen Still. Before Teddy Pendergrass became a husband, trying to rebuild life in a wheelchair, he had already lived several careers inside one body. He came out of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes with a voice heavy enough to turn slow songs into events, then broke away and built a solo run so powerful that by the end of the 1970s, he had stacked 5 consecutive platinum albums and turned tracks like Close the Door, Love TKO, and Turn Off the Lights into part of the permanent language of black romance. Then March 18, 1982, shattered the momentum. A car crash in Philadelphia left him paralyzed from the chest down, and the man who had once controlled arenas with raw physical presence suddenly had to learn how to live inside a body that no longer answered the same way. Karen Still entered that chapter with far more weight than a celebrity spouse usually carries. She had danced with Philadanco and had also appeared in Teddy's shows before they married in June 1987. By then, he was no longer the invincible sex symbol fans had projected onto him in the late 1970s. He was a man recovering, adapting, trying to hold together identity, dignity, and career after disaster had already rewritten his life. The marriage lasted 15 years. How many relationships can survive when one person has to love not just the star they first knew, but the entire life that comes after catastrophe changes him forever? He kept going. He returned to performing, published his autobiography Truly Blessed in 1998, and remained visible well beyond the years when most people expected him to disappear. Karen was part of that long middle stretch the years after the crash, but before the final chapter of his life. They divorced in 2002. Teddy later married Joan Williams in 2008 and died in 2010 at age 59. The marriage to Karen did not last forever, but it sat inside one of the hardest parts of his story, the years when survival itself had become part of the performance. Wesley Snipes and April DuBois. Wesley Snipes married April DuBois in 1985 before the public saw him as Blade, before New Jack City, before White Men Can't Jump, before the whole image of Wesley hardened into that sharp mix of athletic control, menace, and style. Back then, he was still a young actor trying to force his way into the business after training at SUNY Purchase, and the marriage belonged to the chapter when the future was still uncertain and the fame had not arrived to rearrange the house yet. Their son, Jelani Asar Snipes, was born in 1988, which means fatherhood entered his life before the biggest part of his screen legend did. The marriage ended in 1990, right before the run of roles that changed his name into something much larger in American film. That early timing gives the relationship its weight. April was there before the iconic version of Wesley existed in the public mind, before audiences connected him with box office power, martial arts cool, and the long action streak that followed. Then the rise came fast. New Jack City hit in 1991, Passenger 57 and White Men Can't Jump pushed him further, and by the late 1990s, the Blade films had turned him into one of the defining black action stars of his era. How many relationships survive the moment a man stops being a husband with potential and turns into a public figure? The whole industry suddenly wants a piece of. He kept building after that first marriage ended. A second marriage came in 2003, more children followed, and the career kept stretching across decades through setbacks. Prison return, and then that 2024 Blade comeback in Deadpool and Wolverine that put him back in headlines all over again. But April remains tied to the earliest serious chapter of his adult life, the years before the mythology, before the comeback narratives, before people started talking about Wesley Snipes as an institution instead of a man still trying to become one. Miles Davis and Cicely Tyson. Miles Davis did not marry a young ingenue dazzled by his legend. He married Cicely Tyson in 1981, and she was already an acclaimed actress, already older than him by about 2 years, already carrying a kind of poise that did not bend easily around male brilliance. By then, Miles had changed jazz several times over from Kind of Blue to the electric turn that split his audience, and Cicely had already built a career with roles that gave black womanhood gravity, beauty, and authority on screen. Their wedding itself looked like a gathering of power. It was held at Bill Cosby's home and officiated by Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young. But the real story started long before that. Cicely and Miles had been circling each other since the mid-1960s, pulling apart, coming back, trying again, carrying years of unfinished feeling before they ever said vows aloud. By the time they finally married, the attraction between them was not soft or simple. Miles was magnetic, difficult, erratic, wounded, and already famous for volatility. Cicely brought discipline, elegance, and a steadier center into his life, and for a while she became one of the few women who could reach him in ways that mattered. She helped him through periods when his body and career were both under strain, and the marriage sat inside one of his late career resurgences when albums like We Want Miles and Tutu helped restore his place in the conversation. But the same force that made Miles extraordinary also kept tearing at the marriage. Cicely later wrote and said publicly that he was unfaithful. She spoke about joy jokes and deep love, but also about wounds that stayed close because the person who hurt her was the person she had loved most. How many women can stand beside a genius, admire him fully, and still survive the damage that genius brings into the house with it? The marriage ended in 1988, and the divorce was finalized in 1989. Miles died 2 years later. Cicely kept speaking of him with tenderness that never erased the truth of what she had lived through. She did not reduce him to a monster, and she did not lie about what it cost to love him. Their story stayed in that hard space between devotion and injury, between prestige and disorder, between a woman older, wiser, and fully formed, and a man gifted enough to bend music itself, but not always his own life. Nick Cannon and Mariah Carey. Nick Cannon was still in his 20s when he stepped into Mariah Carey's orbit, and she was already one of the biggest voices in popular music, more than a decade older, already carrying diamond records, a public mythology, and the kind of fame that changes the temperature of every room. They had first crossed paths years earlier, then the connection sharpened in 2008 when she cast him in the Bye Bye video. What followed moved fast. On April 30th, 2008, they got married in the Bahamas after a whirlwind courtship, and the speed of it made the whole thing feel even louder, because this was not some ordinary celebrity pairing. It was a younger television star and comedian tying himself to a woman whose name already sat near the top of the industry. The marriage kept building in public. They renewed their vows more than once, and on April 30th, 2011, their twins, Monroe and Moroccan, were born on their third wedding anniversary. For a while, the picture held family photos, red carpets, holiday moments, and the sense that Nick had stepped into a life much larger than the one he had known before. But the size of Mariah's world did not stay abstract. In 2024, Nick said openly that he wrestled with insecurity during the marriage, especially around money identity, and the feeling that he had become Mariah's man instead of simply himself. He talked about her as the alpha, and admitted that the imbalance got into his head. How many men can walk into a marriage with a woman that powerful and never once feel the weight of her legend pressing against their own name? They separated in 2014, finalized the divorce in 2016, and the marriage closed after 8 years, but it never turned into the kind of scorched earth celebrity ending people expected. The children stayed at the center. By 2025 and 2026, Mariah was still speaking publicly about co-parenting with fairness and keeping life steady for Monroe and Moroccan, while recent coverage kept showing the twins moving easily between both parents. The romance ended. The bond did not disappear with it. Nick Cannon's most famous marriage was not with a woman younger, quieter, or easier to stand beside. It was with Mariah Carey, older, larger, richer in history, and impossible to enter halfway. Boris Kodjoe and Nicole Parker. Boris Kodjoe did not step into marriage with a woman the world needed to introduce to him. Nicole Parker was already fully formed on her own path, born in 1973, years before Boris, with film work behind her and a screen presence that had already moved through Boogie Nights, Remember the Titans, and then Soul Food. Boris, born in 1973, came into the public eye with a different rhythm model. Looks athletic grace, a rising acting career, and the kind of face television knew how to use. They met on the set of Soul Food, the series, in the early 2000s, where she played Terry and he played Damon, and the working relationship turned into something neither of them treated lightly. Years later, Boris said he knew early that Nicole would become his wife even while life around them was still complicated and unfinished. They married on May 21, 2005 in Gundelfingen, Germany, not long after welcoming their daughter Sophie in March of that same year. A second child, Nicholas, followed in October 2006. Then the real test arrived fast. Sophie was born with spina bifida, and the marriage had to grow inside hospital routines, care schedules, and the kind of fear young parents do not get to rehearse. They did not let that sit in silence. They built what became the Kodjoe Family Foundation, using their platform to push awareness, education, and support around spina bifida, while still raising both children and keeping their careers alive. How many Hollywood marriages stay standing when fame, parenting, illness, travel, and 2 full careers all arrive at once? Nicole remained visible in television and film, later moving into projects like And Just Like That, while Boris continued working across television, movies, and hosting. By 2024, People was calling them one of Hollywood's strongest marriages, and Boris was still talking publicly about the work of staying close, making time, and refusing to give up on each other. In 2026, People was still revisiting their story through Soul Food, their family, and the marriage that had already lasted more than 20 years. Boris Kodjoe did not marry a woman older than him for novelty, and the relationship never played like a headline built around a number. He married Nicole Parker, and the years since have looked like what most celebrity couples only promise at the beginning: family, strain, work, survival, and a bond that kept choosing not to leave. Rodney Peete and Holly Robinson Peete. Rodney Peete did not marry into a woman who needed the public to explain her value. Holly Robinson Peete was already visible from childhood television into adult acting, with 21 Jump Street helping turn her into a familiar face, and she was a little older than Rodney from the start. People noted on their 30th anniversary in June 2025 that Holly was 60 and Rodney 59. They met in the early 1990s, with Holly later recalling that actress Layla Rochon helped bring them together, and they married on June 10, 1995. By then, Rodney was carrying the life of an NFL quarterback, and Holly was already moving through television with her own name, her own career, and her own momentum. Their marriage did not begin with one person building, while the other waited to be discovered. It began with two adults already in motion, and the woman was the older one. Then children came fast, and life stopped being theoretical. They built a home with 4 children, twins Ryan and Rodney Jr., then Robinson and Roman, while Rodney's football years and Holly's acting life kept demanding time travel and public energy. Their oldest son, RJ, was diagnosed with autism at age 3, and that diagnosis changed the family's direction enough that Holly and Rodney expanded their foundation work into autism advocacy. The Holly Rod Foundation, founded by the couple in 1997, became one of the most visible service projects attached to their name, first shaped by Holly's father's Parkinson's battle, and later widened by RJ's diagnosis. In 2025, reporting still showed the foundation active with autism-focused events and partnerships, including work tied to the Dodgers. How many marriages survive when fame, football, television, children, diagnosis, and advocacy all arrive before the marriage has even had time to coast? They are still married now, and by 2025 they had reached 30 years together, marking the milestone publicly while talking about patience surrounding the marriage with people who believe in it and still making room for flirtation after 3 decades. Holly continued acting and producing. Rodney moved into broadcasting and public work, and the family they built stayed at the center instead of becoming collateral damage around 2 careers. The age gap never needed to be loud. It was already there in the shape of the marriage itself, Rodney choosing a woman slightly older, already established, already steady, then staying with her long enough for the years to turn that choice into a life. These men may have had the fame, the money, and the spotlight, but in some of the most unforgettable chapters of their lives, they chose women who were older, wiser, and already fully formed before the world finished shaping them. Some of these marriages lasted. Some fell apart. But every one of them challenged the old idea that love only works one way in public life. Which couple on this list surprised you the most? And do you think age truly matters when the connection is real? Leave your thoughts below and follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more stories that rewrite what people think they know about Black love and legacy.